So some of the things that you're going to see in here when we're fastening wood together, and you'll see this in that video that you're going to watch next week, is that there are different joints that we can kind of put together. There is a ton of different styles that we can do. A little dado where you basically cut out a thing. We use that on our step stools that we build. We do dovetails. We did those ones on our step stools as well. What's the other one? Where's a mortise and tenon? You'll see that in the bar stool that we made. And it's a pretty cool little process to actually kind of make that. But this one's basically like a little pin that goes into the wood. So you got a hole in the wood, you got a pin, pretty strong joint. Some of these things are kind of there. They're kind of designed to where we don't really need to use a whole lot of fasteners. It's actually kind of fun if you do woodworking to actually build things to where you don't have to use screws and different things. If you cut the wood, you can join them together like puzzle pieces to kind of put these things together. So there's a lot of different joints. I'm not going to worry about all of those. There's just a couple of ones that we really want to focus on. Dados, if you notice on this one, we kind of cut out this board right here. And then the other board just slips right into that. That's great for like shelving, different things that you don't want to move. And it's going to hold that stuff in place, right? You know, if you kind of tilted this thing, if this was tilted upright, you can see that board right there, all the pressure that would be pushing down on this thing is going to transfer into here, and it's going to go down into that bottom. Now, some boards, you might not think boards are very strong, but boards, the force that it would take to collapse this downwards is incredibly strong. Like you would I don't even know what kind of force you would need, but you know, if you took a sledgehammer to that stuff, you would dent that wood, but you wouldn't completely collapse this. Sometimes the boards can break depending on how you cut these things, depending on how that grain's going. Your grain should always go the longest distance. If the grain was going this way and not this long distance here, if it was going this way, it would break very easily. And I think I show you guys that in the video too. So you can actually see that when you watch that video. You'll see what happens with the board if you don't have the grain going the right way. But this board, I mean, it's going to be pretty strong. And so that joint, it's going to hold, if it's a bookshelf that you're making, it's going to hold those books up there, and it's not going to have any problems with that at all, as long as that stays in there. And typically we use like a glue joint to kind of hold them together. Dovetails are a pretty cool one. You'll notice they did kind of two different wood styles on here. Sometimes people do that. They get real fancy. They essentially just cut like this trapezoid out. And then on the other end, they kind of do like the negative space. And these things just basically, they slip in together, and it's a nice joint. It holds together well. There's no need for any kind of fasteners or anything like that. Like I said, typically we just glue that stuff together. And that's typically it. You see it a lot on drawers, boxes, different things, especially if you want to show it off, because these are a lot of work to do. Dovetails are not easy. We do have some tools that will make it quicker, that can actually cut these things out. They have jigs that you can put them together. If you're doing them by hand, they can be pretty tough. The mortise and tenon, you'll see these on like legs, like for like dining room chairs and things like that. Typically they're hidden, so you don't see these things. But essentially we got this board here. We kind of cut out a lot of material, but we left a little pin. And then on the opposite side, on the mortise side, we actually cut a little hole on the inside, and that just basically slips up into there. Pretty strong joint. It joins these things together. Again, we use glue on these things. There's no need for fasteners. We use glue to kind of hold them together, and it's a pretty strong joint that's going to support quite a bit. You do see a rabbet. Sometimes it's a double rabbet or a single rabbet, but this is going to be on like the edge. You might see these on drawers and boxes as well. Not as fancy as a dovetail, but it does get that job done. It does work pretty effectively. We glue those things together, and then it basically holds. Not as strong as a dovetail either, but it's a quicker way to do this. We can take a router, we can take a blade, we can cut here, we can cut down to cut that little L shape out, and then we can join them together. Kind of the same thing on the double rabbet, except there's two of them that are there. Half lap joints, you see these things, on like tables and different stuff like that. Basically, you're cutting out like half of the thickness there, half the thickness on that one, and you put them together. These boards will sit level when you do that. And so like on this one, if you want to make it like a 90 degree, that works really well. You can kind of see it here in this table right here on this end piece where they did a little half lap where they kind of cut out, half that board there, and then half of this one, they put it together. And that one, in this example, this kind of helps hold all these different boards together right here on the end. and it joins them. It looks like they got some pins, or those, so I think those are nuts actually. But different ways that you can kind of do that, and you can, join wood together. If we want to remove wood to kind of make some of those joints, like a half lap or something like that, you can see on this example, we're taking a little saw and we're making multiple cuts. So that way there's things are really thin. We take a little chisel and we basically put it in those joints there, and we move it back and forth. It breaks those things out. And then we can kind of clean it up with a file. You'll see me do that in the video and how we remove that stuff, but just making multiple cuts in between where we want it to go. And then we can join those boards together, use some glue on there, and it's going to be strong. Glue is one of those things that a lot of people think is not that strong, but the glue in most wood glues is actually stronger than the boards themselves. And so if you've got a nice surface, you've got a good joint there, that glue is going to help hold that stuff together, and it's not going to come apart. It's going to break somewhere else. We do have a little cheater device here. We actually don't have one at the school, but I have one at home because I like doing woodworking. It's fun. But if you want to make like a nice flat tabletop and it needs to be pretty wide, you can simply take this little biscuit joiner, and these are little biscuits. We don't eat them. They're not like biscuits and gravy, okay? They're little wood particles that have been glued together and kind of pressed together. And we take this little biscuit joiner, which basically just kind of cuts this little notch out. And then those biscuits are able to kind of just slip into there. We put some glue together and we can line those boards up. It's a nice flat surface. It joins them together as opposed to just taking two flat ends and then just pushing them together. It gives a little bit of strength. So if you want to do like a tabletop and things like that, biscuit joiner is a pretty good way, and it's hidden. You don't see these things, from the top or the bottom, okay? You don't have to have anything else there. It's just going to join them together. But that's kind of the importance of having that wood, make sure it's dried out, because if you try to glue these things together, and let's say you glue them together and then that wood dries out, you're going to get a ton of cupping where it's going to go up or it's going to go down, because wood is just naturally going to do that. It's going to have that cupping. You might see dowel joints, things like that, if you ever put like furniture together. And that's where we basically drill a hole, we put a dowel on the inside and we join them together. So a lot of prefab furniture, you'll see that stuff with, because it's easier for them just to kind of do that. It doesn't take very much. They can have it all there. They give you the bag of the little dowels already cut to length, and you just slip those pieces in. It's strong, it's effective. It may not be the cleanest, it may not be the prettiest way to kind of do it, but it does work pretty well. And that's why you see it a lot on like furniture stuff. Again, the best way to do this is to kind of glue it together. You may have a clamp on here that kind of holds this together while that glue is drying. Typically takes about 30 minutes for wood glue to kind of set. And so you may have clamps, and really kind of with the other joints too, you may kind of clamp things down while that glue is setting, because otherwise it may move or shift on you to kind of hold them in place. But this can be done very easily. This is a joint that really doesn't take a lot of fancy tooling. All you really need is a drill bit. You can drill a hole, you can get a wooden dowel, you can cut that dowel to whatever length you want, and then you basically just slip it in. So it's a very easy one to kind of make. And they do have jigs, Craig jigs. They make stuff where you can actually, cut these little dowel holes out and make life a little bit easier to kind of put things together. And this is kind of an example of, one of those little things that we would do. A lot of times like cabinet doors for like kitchens, frames and, picture frames and stuff like that. Craig jig has a little jig that you clamp on. It allows this to drill at an angle, and then we put a little screw in there. And this is like a hidden screw. They have wood that you can actually put over the top of this thing. You could sand it down to where it's flat. You can match that wood type to it, and you'll never know that there was actually hardware in there. Sometimes when we're doing woodworking, we don't like to see that hardware. We don't want that, right? Woodworkers, they like to kind of take pride in craftsmanship and stuff like that. And this is kind of a way to cheat that system to get a good frame that's got a nice tight joint, but then you don't see, that stuff on the backside. Typically you'd put these on the backside, not the front. So if it's a picture frame, right, where it's hanging against the wall, this would sit up against the wall, and you don't have to fill those in, but if you wanted to, you absolutely could. When we are drilling holes, we use countersinks, okay? If we were to just drill a straight hole and then put a wood screw in, you notice how the head is right here. The way that head sits, if you were to sink this down farther, it's gonna put pressure on this board, and you're gonna split a board across. And so what we do is we drill a hole, we use a countersink that kind of, matches the shape of that head, and allows us to push that thing in without putting pressure on that board and causing it to split. You do have to, if you're screwing, you do have to pre-drill holes. Otherwise, boards are going to split, okay, especially if they're real dry. So you can do a 2 combination, or you can buy one that has the drill bit and the little countersink head in it. And you can see there's different sizes for different size screws, and we can kind of push those things down. So if you aren't just doing joints, you know, you can do a little countersink, which is going to drop that stuff down and just kind of remove that material. It's important that we remove some of it. We don't want all of it. Obviously, we want the threads to be able to grab into that wood. So the bits are a little bit smaller for the size of the screw that we're doing. And the head size is obviously going to change as the screw gets bigger. So the countersinks are going to be a little bit different. I don't really prefer this method here. I prefer buying these things. Typically, if you go to like Home Depot, you buy them. It's a set of like 4 of them. So you might get like these 4 right here in a set. So you have a couple different ones that you can choose from depending on what screw you're putting in. Another way we can kind of do like a hidden fastener, and typically you see like these finishing nails on like railings and things like that. It's a very tiny nail, a very tiny head on the nail. We actually drive it in with a hammer. We take this little thing called a nail set, which just kind of comes to a point. It has like a kind of a concaved, you know, look on the end of it. And it sits on the end of this head, and then you just hit this thing down, and then it should be recessed below that surface. Very, very tiny. You don't see these things you know, unless you're really looking for them. So again, it's a way for us to kind of hide that. You see this a lot on railings. They kind of go and they kind of toenail it into the side. So they might put 2 of them on the very bottom, 2 of them into the top. Okay, so that way you're not seeing this hardware, you're not seeing all this stuff, but you're getting those things secured. Sometimes you can't put a screw in through the top, or you don't want to screw in through the top, or you can't put it up through the bottom. And so these finishing nails are a good way to kind of hold that railing in place. Now, a lot of these joints, we're obviously going to use glue. I've mentioned that a bunch of times. When you're gluing things together, you want to make sure that you have enough glue to where it's going to squeeze it out of that joint. Like you can see right here, there's not any gaps like you have right here. That means there's too little glue. That means anywhere like in this section and that section and this section, that means it didn't actually fill up that whole joint, and that's going to be your weak spots. We would rather than this, we would rather have too much glue, but this is a lot of extra work to kind of clean up. Glue does get on the surface. If you like wipe it down here, it'll basically just kind of cover that surface. If you try to stain it, it's not going to stain very well. So you have to sand that stuff down. If we had something like this, where we had too much glue in here, and even if we have this one, how it kind of squeezes out, what I typically do is just let that stuff dry in place. And then I just take a putty knife and it scrapes right off. And then the only spot where there's glue is right in that joint, right where that joint's at. But we typically don't like to smear this stuff with like a rag because it will just kind of, it will block stains and it'll make things look kind of funky. But you want to make sure you put enough glue to where it's going to come out of that whole joint and try not to get too much like this. But we would prefer this versus that, because this is just, the issue with this is because glue is not expensive, but the issue is just the cleanup process with this. It's going to be a lot harder to clean this stuff up. But at least on this one, it's going to hold. It's going to maintain, you know, that strength that we have with that stuff. Cool. All right. That's the last part of that.